Good morning. We are speaking here today on Treaty 6 territory, and I would also like to acknowledge the Métis people of Alberta who share a deep connection to this land. I'm joined here today with the leader of the Alberta's New Democrats, Rachel Notley. Today, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates by 0.75%, a triple dose increase. This is on top of a full percentage point increase this summer, which was the largest since 1998. Interest rates are an important tool to contain inflation in the long term, but in the short term mean a lot more pain for Albertans with debt. Mortgages, car loans, lines of credit, they all get more expensive and harder to pay off. While today's rate of inflation is a problem, the provincial government should not make a bad situation worse. Many Albertans also owe money directly to the provincial government in the form of student loans. Under this UCP government, the burden of those debts has gotten heavier and heavier. Minister Dimitrios Nicolaides has cut $690 million from post-secondary schools and allowed tuition to skyrocket. This past year, he's approved hikes of anywhere from 16 to 104% for some courses at the University of Alberta, for example. These tuition rates represent more than $10,000 in additional annual fees for some programs, such as an MBA. At the same time, and this is the real cruel part, the UCP has added an interest surcharge onto student loans. During our NDP government, and even the PCs previously, Alberta students paid a prime rate for their student loans so that the government essentially broke even on the student loan program. But since 2020, this UCP government has added an additional percentage point on top of that, effectively profiteering off of student loans for students. So while government is enjoying a $13 billion surplus driven by oil revenues, and while Alberta families are struggling to pay for food and keep a roof overhead, the UCP is charging Albertans extra interest rates to student loans they had to take out to cover for their soaring tuition costs. That extra interest rate hikes, like one today, makes even life more painful for students across this province. This is the wrong direction for Albertans. To talk about a better path forward, I'll pass things over now to Rachel Notley.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. You know, the numbers speak for themselves. Today, StatsCan reported that tuition rates in Alberta are the fastest rising amongst the major provinces. This year alone, undergraduate tuition rose by 9.7% in Alberta. That's nearly 4 times faster than the national average of 2.6%. Over the past 2 years, Alberta's undergraduate tuition fees have risen by 17.9%, by far the highest in the country. And over that same period, tuition fees for undergraduates increased nationally by just 4.3%. So it's almost 4 times as much in Alberta. As the StatsCan report also noted, Alberta undergraduate students will also pay the highest additional compulsory fees anywhere in the country, which are 24% above the national average. But here's the thing, behind those rather worrisome and stark numbers are real Albertans. Albertans who are trying to make a better life for themselves and their families, working very hard in the process. They're young people trying to launch a career, and also maybe not so young people trying to change a career as they work to provide a better standard of living for themselves and their families. The money they are spending on monthly student debt payments is just one more steep monthly bill during the worst affordability crisis Albertans have seen in 40 years. It's money they can't spend on groceries or utilities or on supporting local businesses. It's money they can't save up to buy a home or to start their own business. Worst of all, these punitive tuition and extra interest costs will push post-secondary education out of reach for many Albertans. It will drive young Albertans out of the province, in fact, to pursue their dreams elsewhere. And it will deter people from coming here to study and work and innovate and generally grow our economy the way they have for so many years. The real Alberta advantage is a skilled and hard-working labor force, and the UCP is throwing that advantage away. So I see a better path, one where our post-secondary schools create exciting opportunities for all Albertans and help drive a diverse economy forward. Now, you can read our full plan with respect to post-secondary education at albertasfuture.ca. But today, I am here to make this commitment. I promise that if elected, my government would get started with 2 actions. The first is to abolish the UCP's extra interest surcharge on student loans. This is, as David said, this is cruel profiteering on the backs of students, and we will put a stop to it. Alberta students will once again be able to borrow at the prime rate, just like they used to be able to do before the UCP government was elected. According to the UCP's own estimates, this will put roughly $30 million a year back into the pockets of Alberta students. Secondly, we will put a cap on rising tuition costs. Students and schools both need to be able to plan for the future, and so we will work closely with post-secondary institutions and with student groups to achieve this goal. Strong and properly funded post-secondary schools do not need to impose annual 104% increases on course fees. So these are just 2 simple steps, and as I said, you could read our full plan at albertasfuture.ca. But the bottom line is this. Ready access to post-secondary education is crucial if we're going to build a modern and diverse economy, one that creates exciting opportunities and good-paying jobs for all Albertans and also for generations to come. That's the kind of work an NDP government will undertake. Now, before Dave and I take your questions on this issue, I will also say just a few words about the Premier's comments today on healthcare. While the UCP is launching RFPs for more private surgeries, we are seeing terrible scenes play out in major hospitals across our province. 14-hour waits at the Red Deer emergency room. Albertans literally sprawled out on the floor at the waiting room at the Misericordia because there is no doctor there to see them. We have a serious crisis in our hospital and our ambulance system and in our doctors' offices. But we didn't hear a word of acknowledgement of these problems from the Premier today. He also failed to acknowledge that his plan for privatization will actually serve to steal more scarce resources from our struggling public system and make the problems I just described considerably worse. And that's why today's announcement by the UCP government is bad news for Alberta families. Everything we've heard from UCP leadership candidates so far suggests that they will do everything they can to press for even more chaos within our healthcare system. Our healthcare system cannot withstand another 4 years of UCP leadership. It just can't. An NDP government, led by me, will fix our healthcare system and make sure that care is readily available for Albertans and their families when they need it. So thank you, and David and I are ready to take any questions you may have.
So you had an op-ed in most media about the sovereignty aspect, and we're talking about how this is going to graduate into investor confidence. It's going to be bad for Albertans. But I'm wondering, what impact is just the fact that this is a national conversation at this point have? Like, the fact that everybody's talking about this Sovereignty Act, what impact are we seeing on Albertans' lives right now?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that the Sovereignty Act is not focused on addressing the priorities of Albertans. Albertans are concerned about affordability. Albertans are concerned about their crumbling healthcare system. Albertans are concerned about whether there's a future for their children in an education system able to provide that to them. So this conversation about sovereignty is a distraction from the priorities that Albertans actually have. Let me also say this. The Sovereignty Act is a fraud. It is, however, the predictable and next logical step of the path that Jason Kenney first set this province on. And what should be most troubling to most Albertans is the number of UCP members and UCP caucus members who are actually promoting this fraud at this point. Albertans need a government that is focused on their priorities, not fraudulent claims designed to distract from the government's inability to address the needs that Albertans want to see them focus on.
And going back to what the Premier said this morning about the healthcare system, he said Alberta Health Services failed to take his political direction on expanding the healthcare system capacity. What do you think could have been done differently to expand that? There's one person that has been in charge of our healthcare system as it has faced unprecedented levels of deterioration and crisis over the last 3 years. And that person is Jason Kenney, supported by the UCP government. They made the political decision to attack doctors and rip up their contracts, to threaten to fire tens of thousands of frontline healthcare workers, to tell nurses that they needed to get ready for a 10% pay cut, to delist a whole range of services, and to create chaos in our system by fracturing it and trying to privatize pieces of it in order to, I don't know, give money to their friends and insiders. Who knows? So where AHS has failed to deliver, the responsibility rests entirely and completely on the shoulders of the UCP, which, in addition to all the things I just said, has actually been pulling money out of our healthcare system at an unprecedented rate. So Jason Kenney's attempts to whine about AHS is nothing but a continuation of a long practice of failing to take responsibility for really bad decisions that he has made that hurt Albertans.
CBC, Kat partially took my question, but I guess I would just press further on that and say, what do you think about the Premier's remarks that AHS was providing wildly different estimates of the number of ICU beds that could be made available during the pandemic, and that number kept getting smaller? He said that inconsistent information was unacceptable during a crisis. Do you have any sympathy for him there?
I really don't. Because I'll tell you this, when we first started hearing them talking about the wild plans that they had to increase ICU beds, we heard immediately from people that those numbers weren't real, because an ICU bed, you can put the sign ICU beside a bed, but if you don't have the staff beside it, it's not an ICU bed. And we heard it the minute that number came out of the Premier's mouth at the very, when we were deep in the crisis. So I frankly simply don't believe Jason Kenney when he tries to tell Albertans that he was given a number and told that he could rely on it, because the information was widely available that those numbers were pretend, and they weren't real ICU beds, because we didn't have the staff that were necessary. And so I just don't buy it. And at the same time, what we do know is that, as I said before, this is a government that has misled Albertans about the level of funding that they have been putting and dedicating to our healthcare system. They have shortchanged it, the system, dramatically over and over since they've been elected, and they have created multiple levels of chaos and uncertainty throughout the system and continued on that path even when it was clear to them that we were going into a generational healthcare crisis driven by the pandemic.
Yeah, just related to that, what do you think of this idea that leaders sometimes share that difficulty managing the pandemic and the impact on the health system is solely or primarily a result of the capacity of the health system to handle a large influx of sick people at once?
Well, I'm not quite sure what your question is there. I mean, I think we're getting into policy here. I think you know, when you're looking at a pandemic, there's a number of different things that one can do to make sure that we get through the pandemic, both in an economically secure way, and of course, most importantly, in a way where our health is secure. The first thing to do is to reduce the risk of infection, and to take common sense measures to ensure that that happens. The healthcare system is there to provide care where that effort is not successful, but it is not the only tool at our disposal, and it was not designed to be the only tool at our disposal, and certainly the UCP has not funded it to be the only tool at our disposal.
Can you still hear me? It's Janet. Oh, okay. I'll ask another question about post-secondary, since that's why we're here.
Thank you.
Said, no worries. On topic. Amazing. You said that you would work with post-secondary to impose or create a tuition cap. But tuition caps are quite controversial because people who don't believe in them say that that's how you end up on the other end of it, with these huge increases in tuition after the tuition cap is lifted, to try and catch up with inflation or catch up. So what's your model then for trying to adequately fund these institutions if tuition is going to be frozen? How long would you freeze that tuition for?
Well, I guess two things. First of all, in response to the assertion that you repeated there, I think that it is not necessarily the case that when you remove the cap on tuition, whether it's a freeze or a restriction on how much it can increase, that it must necessarily go up to quote unquote make up for the difference. That only happens if you make the decision that we must have the most expensive tuition in the country, and that post-secondary education is something you should only have access to if you have the means. There are many post-secondary models out there in Western democracies that rely considerably less on tuition as a means of funding post-secondary. And so one does not automatically lead to the other unless you have a government that is focused on making post-secondary accessible to all people regardless of their income, and that government is then followed by a government that believes that post-secondary should only be available to those with the elite resources. But that being said, what I'm suggesting here is we haven't actually said freeze. What we're saying is we want to put in place a cap that is both allows for only modest increases, maybe a freeze, but maybe modest increases that are predictable. And so predictability is the other issue. And so that's why we would negotiate and talk with student groups as well as post-secondaries in order to look at, you know, what areas have had these massive increases and what we can do to make those more accessible, and at the same time look at sort of a modest path forward. As you know, the law that was in place that the UCP ripped up tied tuition increases to the rate of inflation. That was a reasonable formula for tuition increases after our cap, our freeze came off. But of course, that's no longer the right formula because inflation is so out of control. I don't think, my view is that that's not a reasonable formula. And so we would allow probably for increases, but at a much more modest pace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching, and to learn more, check out albertasfuture.ca.